I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Richard Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Our guest is former Atlanta mayor and president of the Buckhead Coalition, Mayor Sam Massell. Welcome, Mr. Mayor.
Glad to be here.
You know, the Massell name is as much Atlanta as Five Points, Westview Cemetery, Henry W. Grady, and Peachtree Street. So let's begin by talking about your father, Sam Massell Sr., your Uncle Ben, who were pioneers in the growth of Atlanta. Tell us about them.
Well, my dad was born in Atlanta, but my Uncle Ben and the other brother, Levi, there were three brothers, were born in Lithuania. Came here as children with their parents who opened a wholesale, well, more retail, I guess, a mixed grocery business in Atlanta. And after school, the three of them got involved in real estate development. And frankly, they built most of the apartment buildings on Boulevard and Parkway and Ponce de Leon, that northeast quadrant of Atlanta. In fact, you can still spot their buildings because they had an in-house architect, and they had each building was designed with a Spanish tile parapet at the second floor, so you can spot them in business properties as well. They did little strip centers. There's several of their stores still standing in Little Five Points in the Grant Park area and Emory and elsewhere. So they were major developers, and then the Depression came. Actually, it's interesting. I ran across a little catalog called the Massell Blue Book recently, over 100 pages of properties that they owned throughout Atlanta, and this was back when the three of them were together. The Depression came, and they busted out like everybody else, and my dad then pursued the legal profession, went to Atlanta Law School, and he practiced law for many years. He knew a lot about real estate, but after that he was nervous about debt and wouldn't buy anything unless he could buy it for cash. He didn't want any mortgages. He didn't want to have to borrow any money and owe it to anybody. On the other hand, Ben, the other brother, went back in the business and amassed another fortune building most of Midtown office buildings along Peachtree and West Peachtree in particular. My dad was a good influence on me from childhood. For one thing, I had a work ethic that was inborn. I just believed, though I was never told that I had to go out and work, but I believed I was supposed to work, and I always worked from childhood up, whether it was selling Coca-Colas with a stand at the corner of North Decatur and Oakdale, or whether it was selling flower seeds door to door, and there was an old national newspaper, I wonder if it's still around, called Grit, and I used to sell subscriptions to that, but I was always selling something. Even when I later went off to college at the University of Georgia, I became business manager of the literary magazine called the Georgia Cracker, and so I made a tidy sum on that at that time. But I mention this because I don't remember ever being told you need to go out and make money, you need to earn your way. I wasn't charged room and board or anything like that. I had an allowance like other kids, and but that was one good message I learned just by osmosis, I guess, being around my father. He also had a love of politics. He, in fact, as a hobby, he edited and published a monthly newspaper for a while called the Atlanta Democrat. And when I was still in high school, I would go to his office and help some with circulation, or selling ads occasionally and whatever. It was, like I say, strictly a hobby. It's not a way to make a living, but Dad loved politics. He used to take me around to political campaigns and to meet candidates. And I remember once seeing old Gene Talmadge on the back of a pickup truck somewhere down near Macon, as I recall, talking to dirt farmers, and he took off his wool hat and handed it down and said, "Boys, give me a nickel or dime, help me, I'll appreciate it." Pass the hat around. And I remember turning to my dad and saying, "That's no money at all." And he said, "You don't understand. If they give him a nickel or dime, they're supporting him. They're going to be for him. They've got an investment." And I teach that to budding politicians to this day, that ask for $1, don't be shy, and once you get that, you got a voter, But anyway, he loved politics. He felt that a Jewish person couldn't get elected citywide in Atlanta. And I remember him discussing that in different occasions. And I remember once asking him, "How do you know a Jewish person has never run citywide?" So I broke the mold, I guess, when I did run citywide for the president of the Board of Aldermen, and got elected to that. But before that, actually, earlier political involvement started. Well, I'm going to tell you a little anecdote because it sounds so good on the tape, No one reviewing this tape will ever have heard of a first quarter freshman in a college being president of his chapter fraternity as a first quarter freshman. Now I'll have to explain how that came about. I went to the University of Georgia, started in 1944. I graduated at 16 and went there to get some education before I got drafted, which I knew was imminent for World War II. And most of the able-bodied men were off at war, so most of the fraternities were closed entirely. The fraternity I pledged, Phi Epsilon Pi, had one member, and in a little apartment over an office in downtown Athens, and he pledged 3 of us, and then he failed and left school. And so the alumni had to rush up there and initiate the 3 of us and hold an election. And I didn't need but one more vote. I had my vote sewed up, see. So anyway, I won by a landslide. That was my first political coup. But what I was going to tell you, my first really elected office was in a little town north of Atlanta, an incorporated city called Mountain Park, Georgia. It's chartered by the state of Georgia like the city of Atlanta is, but on a much smaller scale. It's a resort area with a couple of lakes and swimming pool, and at that time it was the only city in the United States that we knew of where you could vote and hold office and not have your legal residence there. It was chartered that if you were a property owner, you could vote and hold office, which would be unconstitutional now. But I owned a little cabin up there. I bought a cabin, and I was single, and it was sort of a place to get away and rest. And I got on their city council for a couple of years. I don't know how much politics you won in this political interview, but it was real grassroots stuff. In fact, I'll start with my introduction when the political bosses, Charlie Johnson and Lee Wolf, asked me if I'd like to run, and I said, yeah. Election was coming up. And the way they run is everybody just puts their name in the pot, and the top 5 are elected. And I decided to take it seriously, and I went to the city clerk's home, Inez Logue, I remember, with my then girlfriend, Doris Middlebrooks, who's now Doris Massell, my wife of 55 years or better now, and started copying down the list of registered voters. There's a couple of hundred of them. I was going to take it seriously and write them letters. And she said, "Sam, you don't have a chance." And I said, "Why?" She said, "They found out you're Jewish." And I said, well, what do you mean found out? It's not a secret, you know, first of all, and I only live a few miles from here down in Atlanta. And who is they? Well, it turned out they are the same two people that asked me to run. And I went to them and asked them. They said, oh, yeah, we don't want a Jew on the board, on the council. So anyway, long story short, I went ahead and ran, and I lost, but a moral victory. I came in 6 out of the 10 that were running, or 8, I forget now how many. And the 5 are elected, and I was the 6th one. But a month later, one of the 5 sold his property and moved to Florida, and the other 4 elected me to fill the vacancy. Now, I will add to this, I don't know that there's any relationship, but my cabin mysteriously burned down about a year later. So it was, like I say, a place that could be pretty rough. Herman Talmadge owned the place up there, and some other political people of sorts. Anyway, after that, my next elected office was a member of the what was then called the White Democratic Executive Committee, which is interesting in that by its name itself, you can see they weren't allowing blacks to participate. It was to hold the primary. These were the people who established the rules, charged the fees, took the oath of candidacy and so forth. And there were 2 elected from each ward in Atlanta, 8 wards, 16 members, and 2 blacks came to the White Democratic Executive Committee to qualify for their ward. A.T. Walden, who was a very prominent attorney, and Niles Amos, who was a very successful druggist. And the committee turned them down, said we don't qualify, or we don't have black candidates. And so they took it to court, and they won. And out of the 16 members, 15 of them quit. It left one member, wonderful person, Margaret McDougall, whose husband was very prominent in road building in Georgia. But anyway, I contacted Margaret. I didn't even know her then, and I learned about this, and I said, I'll run from my ward, and I'll help you find others to run, and we did. And of course, we dropped the name White. It was just a Democratic Executive Committee, and I was a secretary, and she was a chairman, and it was with our effort, my motion, and she concurred, that we turned the elections into nonpartisan city elections. Prior to that, you had to be nominated in a primary to be in the general election, and there weren't enough Republicans in Atlanta out of the closet that could afford to hold a primary, to hire the poll workers and rent the machines and so forth. So they were really kept out of government, and I didn't think that was right. I thought for local government, although I'm a Democrat, have been all my life, and expect to be long after this tape is completed, the policing and filling potholes and so forth is not partisan in my opinion. And so, and Bill Hartsfield, who was then mayor, agreed with us. So we got the legislature to change it to a nonpartisan election. And so that then eliminated the executive committee. They were, like I said, I served on that for 8 years, 2 terms. My next office was that one with the president of the Board of Aldermen. And it's right, it's interesting on reflection of how that came about, and I'll share with you quickly that as Secretary of the Executive Committee, then called the Democratic Executive Committee, I was qualifying candidates as they'd come in. And at the time, Ivan Allen was running for mayor, and a very fine legislator, member of the House representing Fulton County, Muggsy Smith, was one of his opponents. There were several others too, but Muggsy was, I thought, a real qualified person who had been good to Atlanta when we had 3 House members, 1 Senate member, and Ivan was very well qualified too. So I thought, well, they shouldn't be running against each other. We ought to talk, we as community leaders, whatever, ought to talk Muggsy into running for president of the Board of Aldermen, which is now the City Council, but it was called Board of Aldermen then. And that then later he could run for mayor from that stepping stone. And so every time I see or talk to a major political person, I would suggest this, and I wasn't getting very far with it, but one of those that came up to qualify for Board of Alderman was Everett Milliken, who had been a state senator. And I mentioned this to him, and he said, yes, somebody has to beat Lee Evans, who was the incumbent, because of his opposition to the first one of the public housing projects in Atlanta, which Everett thought was a racial effort opposition, and that Lee Evans needed to be defeated. And I had never thought about it for that reason. As I said, I was just thinking that Muggsy ought to be saved. And so I thought about it that night, and I decided I might run. And I asked 3 people, my wife, I asked A.T. Walden, that black member of the executive committee with whom I'd become friends, and Helen Bullard, who was the political guru of that era. She had handled Ivan Allen's campaigns, Bill Horsfield campaigns, my campaigns, Sidney Marcus. She handled so many good key elections in Atlanta politics. And they all 3 said go for it, and so the next day I qualified myself and ran for that office and won it without a runoff. 4 years later, I got reelected over 5 opponents without a runoff to the president of the Board of Aldermen. So I served that for 8 years. And then Ivan Allen was not running for reelection for mayor. And so that was an opportunity then, and something I thought I could make a contribution, so I qualified to run for mayor. Now this nonpartisan thing that I created came back to bite me, because my main opponent was Rodney Cook, a Republican who was a fine person, but otherwise he might not have ever gotten there. So he was my main opponent. There were others too, and I did win that in a runoff and became mayor. I might mention that in the politics during the years as Board of Alderman, Rodney and Richard Freeman, who was another Republican who later became a federal judge, who's now deceased, and maybe 1 or 2 others. Well, Q.V. Williamson was a Republican, but Richard and Rodney and I were the ones that overturned the ward courtesy arrangement in Atlanta, where the council members had veto rights over liquor licenses, and it was a very dangerous situation for corruption, and we were the Young Turks that took them on and won, and so that was a major victory. When I was president of the Board of Aldermen, I also created the Community Relations Commission because of the frictions between races at that time. I subsequently, when I was mayor making appointments, one of the people I appointed was Andy Young to be chairman of it, and he did an excellent job, and he credits me from time to time by giving him that forum so then he could run for office at higher levels, which he did successfully. But in addition to just race relations that the Community Relations Commission could handle, I felt there were other interests, so I appointed someone to represent senior citizens. They had issues also. And I appointed someone to represent youth. And the young man was a high school student, a black student that I appointed to represent youth, who later became a multimillionaire as CEO of Air Atlanta and some other business interests. But and I also felt the gay community needed to be represented, and I appointed a person at that time who was head of the gay rights movement, or whatever it was called, the organization. He has since passed away. It was interesting, and I'm going to have to add this indictment to this interview. You might want to cut it out later, but when I would make appointments, issue other directives, they would be announced at my Monday morning news conference, which was a regular feature in the mayor's office. And I had this list of appointments, and it had the names of the people and what they represented and where they worked. Well, the young man who was homosexual worked for the Atlanta Journal, and Raleigh Browns was the Atlanta Journal City Hall reporter, and he saw that before I had actually verbalized it, and he went to the telephone and called Jack Tarver, the then publisher of the Journal, and came back and sent me a little note that Tarver didn't want me to appoint him. Well, I did anyway, because I felt their reason was prejudicial, and they didn't give me any other reason not to appoint him. The interesting anecdote is that when they listed all of them in the newspaper the next day, they didn't list that he was with the Journal. They just didn't give him any affiliation, which tells you something, I guess, about how times have changed, for sure. But anyway, on the mayor's race, it was heated. I was able to bring together the black community solidly behind me. Now, it's interesting, incidentally, that I had a black opponent, even that first time.
Dr. Tate.
Horace Tate, and he was articulate, attractive, intelligent, had a following. He'd already been elected to the Board of Education. He was head of the Teachers Guild or something like that, and yet he didn't score at all, because the black leadership told him, "We cannot support you. We don't have enough to elect you." And most people still vote along racial lines. Whites do as well as blacks do, but and other ethnic groups as well. But it's interesting, because this first time I ran for mayor, I got 90% of the black vote and 10% of the white vote. 4 years later, I got 90% of the white vote and 10% of the black vote, because at that time, by then, the African American community was a majority of registered voters, and they turned out better as well. And they made it clear to me, the leadership told me in advance that you've been wonderful, you've done much more than we could have ever asked for, you did things that we would never have anticipated, but we can now elect our own. And I understood that. Didn't like it, but I understood it. And it was very normal. And Maynard Jackson ran and won an honest election. It's interesting that we could tell the difference when we got into the runoff, when we had a boiler room set up where you have a bank of telephones and everybody's calling down a list of registered voters. And in the white areas where they were calling, it seems like every third person was no longer a registered voter, had moved or died or whatever. And the voter registration list had not been pruned. And so had we known that in advance, we would have known we were going to lose. I still would have run. I believe the same way 4 years later, when my friend Sidney Marcus, who'd been my roommate in college incidentally, ran for mayor, I felt that he didn't have a chance to win, and told him so. But I felt the white community needed somebody to run, you know, just the facts of life, that they needed somebody to rally around. And so for him to go ahead, and it would build his stature, which it did dramatically. And but anyway, as mayor, there were many opportunities to do things. That's an office that has a great deal of power, even though back then, under that charter, it was what you call a weak mayor system. The council had equal management rights over the department heads with the mayor, and so it was where you had to exert your own prowess, your own philosophy, your own persuasive powers over council members or whatever. And I've shared with some people, they seem surprised, but the mayor doesn't always go to the council member for his or her vote. the mayor might go outside to the person who owns that council member, and that's putting it harshly, but one who has contributed, supported, who's his ally to get that vote. But anyway, on council, as mayor, there were great opportunities because of the power, and I guess the thing I'm proudest of would probably be creating MARTA, getting it passed. We had to get the legislature, the state legislature, to allow us to put on a sales tax. And at that time, no city, county, authority, Board of Education, or anybody else had a sales tax, just the state of Georgia, 3%. And we had to convince them to let an authority have a sales tax. And then we had to convince the public to vote for it because it had to be a referendum, and it only passed by a few hundred votes, and so anybody who helped, of course, could take full credit. I did some of everything trying to pass it. I even went up in a helicopter over the expressway during the rush hour with a PA system, saying if you want to get out of this mess, vote yes. And this being the Bible Belt, they thought God was telling them what to do, But we worked hard at getting the referendum passed, and that is not only a brick and mortar improvement, but it's a human improvement of services, social services. Mobility is like man's fifth freedom, and without that, you're imprisoned. The poor are in their neighborhoods. They can't get to shopping or to schools or church or parks or anything else. And so it was extremely important to, in my opinion, and we got it passed, and many hundreds of thousands of people use it daily, So it's a good service, and I hope it gets expanded more and more. But one of my big fights with it was getting the fare subsidized. That was my change. Ivan Allen, my predecessor, had tried to get MARTA with an ad valorem tax, and that failed. That's the real estate tax. And so my approach, I repeat, was with a sales tax, but to subsidize the fare. So before they had a private bus company that was about to bankrupt, that Georgia Power had owned, it was 60 cents a ride plus a nickel transfer. And so I figured mathematically how we could drop the fare. In fact, I wanted to do it free. And Charlie Brown, who was was a county commissioner at that time, opposed that. He wanted it 25 cents. He was concerned that if it was free, the winos, they were then called, not homeless, the winos would sleep on it, and so we compromised at 15 cents. Even then, I remember Henry Dotson, who was a member of the Board of Alderman, rode around town in a little Volkswagen Bug with the PA system on it, saying it's a trick. If they can't do it for 60 cents, how are they going to do it for 15 cents? And it was hard for the man on the street to understand how we could. But I went around the community with a blackboard and chalk to show the average domestic worker what their weekly salary was and how much they were transportation was costing them, and how much it would now cost them the next day, because we were going to buy the existing buses and drop the fare immediately, and that they'd actually have money to put in their pocket. It would be a savings to them, not another expense. And that was the truth, and it was important. So another thing I was able to do was make appointments that I guess you'd call it bold back then. It must sound like trite stuff now, but I appointed the first woman to the city council in Atlanta's 125-year history, Pinky Bradley, who was a city planner. Did a great job, and like I say, now it just sounds like nothing. In fact, I gave them an inch. They took over. They got majority of the council, the president of the council, the mayor. All of them are women, but and they do a good job. But back then, they say, where's she going to go to the restroom? It was just shocking to everybody that I would appoint a woman to the city council. I appointed the first black department heads. I had not made any promises or commitments to do so, but then under the charter of Atlanta, the department heads had tenure. They had terms 4 to 6 years, And unless one retired or his term was over, you couldn't make appointments like today. They could appoint thousands. In fact, that's one of the problems. Atlanta back then had about 3,000 city employees. Today they got about 9,000 city employees, the same size population city of 500,000 people. So that's a jobs program, which I don't think is the purpose of city government, but that's a political issue. But my first vacancy was in personnel, and I thought, what a wonderful place. If I could appoint a black head of personnel, that really creates opportunities for the minorities. And so I called in the black leadership, Daddy King and Leroy Johnson, and just the whole crew of all the leaders. And I said, I'll appoint a black if y'all will help me find one that's qualified. And it's interesting because today, in some places, they all appoint my brother, my cousin, or this one or that one or whatever. Back then, they were as serious as I about trying to find somebody who was well qualified. And I was one that had to call my chief administrative officer, George Berry, every so often and say, hey, call him up. You know, I need to appoint. I need to fill that vacancy and push him. And anyway, we finally found a man in New York who handled, who was head of personnel for the YMCA, and he came down and did an excellent job. It was interesting what a good thing that did for race relations, because here were white people who'd never worked with a black, much less underneath one, and he was so good. We had no complaints, no problems, and he served the whole 4-year term and went on after that to the state and did an excellent job. But and the second one was equally as well, head of public works and so forth. But those are opportunities you have when you're in public office, and I'm proud of that we were able to do things that were considered progressive and bold at the time. Then, where do you want me to go from here? That's a political.
I'd like to back up a minute, Mr. Mayor, and to the point where you were at the University of Georgia, but then you went to Emory.
Well, actually, I went to all of them. It's a little embarrassing explaining how and why, but I went first to Georgia immediately from high school. In fact, enrolled in the summer of 1944, so I could get what I could under my belt before I was drafted. And I got so involved. I mean, I was running from one meeting to another. As I said before, if you were a male gender, you could be president of everything on campus overnight. And I was in every organization and every group, and there was just so much that I said, you know, I couldn't say no. I kept getting more and more involved, and it was eating into my academic responsibility. And so I said, I'm going to quit. The only way to do it is cold turkey. I'm going to leave and go to Emory. In fact, it was the middle of a quarter because Emory was on the semester system then. But I quit and went to Emory, and for a year I didn't do anything but go to class, go home, study, go to bed. Go to class, go home, study, go to bed. I did that every day for a whole year, and then I was drafted. Then in the war was about over, I went in the Air Force. I taught school in the Air Force and administrative management, and I was so anxious to get home, to do something. I didn't think I was contributing anything to the world anymore, and so when I got out, I went back to Georgia because I wanted that activity and involvement. And then I got into law school there. I didn't do very well in law school. I started too early. And I said, well, I'll go to Atlanta and go to Atlanta Law School. So I left Georgia and came home to where my dad had a law office and where I could be a clerk or whatever in his office. And I went to Atlanta Law School, but I hadn't finished my bachelor's degree because, like I say, I left the bachelor part, the undergraduate part, a little early to get into the law school, so which you could do back then. I don't think you can now. But anyway, I came to Atlanta, so I also enrolled in Georgia State. And at one time, I was going to two night schools at the same time, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on one, and Tuesday and Thursday or something like that on the other, and working in my dad's law office in the daytime. But then I graduated from Georgia State. In fact, got my bachelor's degree there, and I got my law degree from Atlanta Law School. And then I took a few night courses at Georgia Tech, and then I even started a doctorate degree at Woodrow Wilson Law School, and then I got married, and so I quit. Otherwise, I might have still been going to school. I was not a good student through grade school, high school, college, or postgraduate. I was not a good student, but I was evidently smart enough to know that if I would just keep going, I'd get something just by osmosis, and I believe in that. Yeah.
Your first job was not in law, not in business, not in real estate, but where?
Well, my first job was, I don't know if you knew about it, but if this is the one you're alluding to, but was Chief of Publications for the National Association of Women's and Children's Apparel Salesmen. I was president of the Atlanta Ballyhoo Club, which was a cotillion group, of which incidentally a Broadway show was made called The Last Night of Ballyhoo. And I was instructing the committee chairman what I expected of him, and each one had a senior advisor, and one of the advisors there after the meeting said he was impressed by my meticulous manner, and would I like to come work for him? And I did, and I started there immediately, and he was an interesting, wonderful person, Marshall Mantler, who's since deceased. He was called Buddy Mantler. Talk about Buddy incident, I'm going to go back a few years even before that, because I need to share with you that my high school principal, Hayden C. Bryant, just about a week before I graduated from high school, shook his finger at me, and he was tall and lanky and towering over me, and said, "Buddy," I was called Buddy at that time, said, "Buddy, you'll never amount to anything." And that may have been just a challenge I needed, you know, when I reflect on it. But anyway, Buddy Mantler, whom I went to work for with the NAWCAS, the National Association of Women, Children, and Apparel Salesmen, doing his publications for his membership. It was like a guild, like a union somewhat for traveling salespeople around the country. And I remember the first issue of the paper I brought I put on his desk when he came in. He said, "What's this doing here?" And I said, "Well, it's my first issue. I thought you'd want to see it before I send it to the printer, you know, as dummied up." And he said, "That's not the way I work. I hire you to do a job. You don't do the job, I fire you and hire somebody else, you know." And I was very young and scared to death, but I went back to work and made it perfect. But I was going to tell you that 2 years later, that's how long I worked for him, I had come in for the periodic raise I would ask for, and he said, "No, I'm not going to give you a raise. I'm going to fire you." And I said, "Why? I've done a good job." And I started defending myself. He said, "Oh, all right, if you want, I'll give you another $50 a month raise, and I'll probably do that every year the rest of your life if you want. But the truth of the matter is, it's time you get out and make a real living, and you ought to be in real estate. And I'm going to call Sam Goldberg over at Allen Grayson Realty Company and set up an interview for you." And I went over there and got the job. And the first year, I paid more in income tax than Buddy had paid me in salaries, you know.
Well, that was a mercy firing.
Yeah, he was a good person to throw me out like a bird does its baby to fly, you know. And he was very good for me. So I was in real estate for 20 years, commercial real estate. I became what I think was the world's only specialist in doctor's office buildings. I did one in Atlanta across from the High Museum of Art called the Strickler Building. Did one in Chattanooga, one in Jacksonville. And if I hadn't gotten bit by the political bug, I think I would have become a multimillionaire like my colleagues and peers and buddies and friends, all of whom were pretty successful. But I did all right. You know, you can look at me and see I'm not starving. And I enjoyed real estate, and then you know, got involved full time with the mayor's office, of course, and divested myself of that. When I came out of the mayor's office, I spent 22 years in those different elected offices and gotten much higher than I ever thought I would, and so I decided I would not go back to that. Don't know if your interview wants me to go further with this. My life, it's a little interesting, maybe to some, that how did I decide what I was going to do after that? Because with my big ego, if you've been in office 22 years, you got to have a pretty good sized ego. I felt I could do anything, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I didn't want to go back to real estate. I enjoyed that, but I had conquered that. I'd gotten the Alderman B. Cates Trophy for the Outstanding Deal of the Year 3 times. I'd been a charter member of the $1 Million Club. I'd done real estate, so I wanted to do something different. I got me some large sheets of paper like accountants use with a lot of columns in them, and across each column, across the top in each column, I'd put something that was of interest to me in going to work. Is it a growth industry? Does it cost much money to get into it? Can I capitalize on a public following? Can my family work in it? Whatever was of interest to me. Then I took the yellow section of the phone book, and I read every single category. You'd be shocked at some of the things that are in there. And if it sounded interesting at all, I'd list it on the left and then grade it from 1 to 10 in each column. And then I added all these. It took 2 or 3 months to do this, and I added it all up. Computers, of course, could do it today overnight, but and I came up with 5 entirely different fields. One of them was editing in journalism. I had done a little of that. I mentioned the Georgia Cracker at Athens. I mentioned my dad's Atlanta Democrat. I mentioned, Buddy Mantler's chief of publications, those. And I tried to buy the Fulton County Daily Report, which is a legal organ for Fulton, and had been in the same family for 90 years. And I approached him, and they just would not sell. The interesting part of that is that a year later they did sell to somebody else, but by then I had gone a separate way. One of the 5 things, one was public relations. I like marketing and advertising and public relations, but I felt at that time, although a lot of politicians do it, I felt it would be prostituting my name to immediately go out and use those contacts to help people, and so I shied from that. One was, it's interesting, one was to operate a florist. Now, I've never grown the first flower in my life, but I believe to this day, had I gone and opened a little florist, I think I would have enjoyed it and maybe made a decent, not a big living, but a comfortable enough. I ended up going in the travel business. And it was, I didn't make any real money there, but I put a lot of people to work. My wife worked in there, all 3 children at one time, Cindy, Steve, and Melanie, all 3 worked there at one time, and dozens of other people. I developed a large travel agency, but not real profitable because I was experimenting. It was a challenge. I wanted to be the most diversified travel agency in the world, and I did. I could get you a phony passport if you wanted. I could do anything in travel, I even sold the MARTA card without a commission for MARTA because it was transportation, travel. Anyway, we did that for 13 years. And it was sort of like a sabbatical. I worked without a tie. I traveled the world. I sold dreams, and it was really very enjoyable. And I'd probably still be there if it hadn't been for a headhunter, Korn Ferry Company, that knocked on my door and offered me a glove that just really did fit all the things, my experience in real estate and law and politics and tourism. All of these really played a role in the creation of this Buckhead Coalition, which is a nonprofit civic group like a chamber of commerce for the northern part of Atlanta. And it was started primarily by a guy named Charlie Loudermilk, who brought together 12 of his cronies and said, looking around Buckhead, we shouldn't take this for granted, this progress and prosperity, and we need to supplement government. We need to have a strong group of powerful people who will help when they need it. And like I say, they brought in Korn Ferry and find somebody. And when I met with Charlie and the others, they didn't want to give me but a 1-year contract because they weren't sure the idea would work. I wanted a 3-year contract because I was going to be leaving my travel agency. And we settled on a 2-year contract. Well, here it is, 2008, and it's 20 years later, and we hadn't drawn that contract yet. I hit the ground working and running, and it's been a wonderful, stimulating challenge ever since. We have 100 members. We limit it to 100. It's by invitation. They're all CEOs or equivalent of major firms. The dues are $6,250 a year. That's just the beginning of their financial exposure. If we need more money, we don't go to the public. We go to the members to ask for funds for any program we undertake. Our mission is to nurture the quality of life of the community and help coordinate an orderly growth. We do everything from pave sidewalks in neighborhoods to paying rewards for conviction in heinous crimes to placing portable defibrillators in churches and hotels and office buildings, and having a street ministry to help with the homeless, and you just name it. And we've got initiatives every week that are new and different and challenging. And it's got a good history. It's had a good. We have a waiting list for members. It's by invitation, and we limit it to 100. And I was complimented recently when the city of Charlotte, which is sort of a best-in-class area, invited me to come speak to their Chamber of Commerce of how we marketed Buckhead, because they have an area called South Park that they would like to emulate what we had done, and it's similar somewhat to Buckhead with the big shopping mall and offices and then high-income residents around it. So I'm still healthy and happy, working hard and playing hard.
Let me ask you a question about Buckhead. Did you know Sandy Springs and Johns Creek and Milton have now separated from the county and become cities? Do you have any interest in having Buckhead be a city?
No, actually, there's a group that's trying to push that idea, which is a terrible idea for Atlanta. First of all, they're racially motivated, which I cannot tolerate. But put that aside, what they would do, and incidentally, Atlanta is already in a city where these others that you mentioned were not. They were in unincorporated areas. Atlanta's in the city of Atlanta already. Buckhead is all within the city of Atlanta. And Buckhead is no question about it being the best part of Atlanta is by as far as income, as far as education, as far as job opportunities, just you name it, academic level, whatever index you could use, Buckhead is the best part. Well, if you take that out of Atlanta, what you do to Atlanta would devastate it. It would first of all, it would bankrupt it financially, because Buckhead, although it only has 15% of the population of Atlanta and about 20% of the land, it pays about 45% of Atlanta's ad valorem taxes. You take that out of the city and think what a headline that would be in the New York Times. But every index would worsen. I mean, if Atlanta is now 13th in crime, it might be 3rd in crime. Doesn't mean more crimes. So you take out the place where there's less crimes, the stats become negative. It'd be that had the worst pollution. It'd have the worst illiteracy. You just name it. Everything about it would be worse. And that would just stop growth entirely. Who would want to live in a place like that? Who'd want to move there? Who'd want to open a business there? And, that's thinking so negatively to think that you want to, move away from them. Well, you should think of the whole. Now, I focus all of my attention on Buckhead, day and night, weekends, holidays included. But I'm still part of the whole, and whenever there's something that we work together with the Midtown Alliance and Central Atlanta Progress and Metropolitan Chamber and Atlanta Convention and Business Bureau, we work with all of these people all the time when there's a mutual interest. But it's a terrible idea. Incidentally, we'd even lose our name because there's already a Buckhead, Georgia out on Interstate 20, 60 miles from here. So we'd have to go back to Irbyville, I guess, which was what we were in 1837, I think. But Buckhead's older than Atlanta, incidentally, as far as its identity, but not as a city. But we weren't taken into the city until the 40s, 50s. But it can't be done anyway because it has to go through the legislature to create an authority to do that. Excuse me. And Ed Lindsay, who's our representative from this area, says he won't introduce it, but if he did, he'd be hard-pressed to get a second vote. And it's you'd have to have a majority of the local delegation. No way that's going to happen. If that somehow did happen, you'd still have to have a vote, a referendum that would include all of Atlantans. They're not about to give up Buckhead, so it's not going to happen. But it's just a terrible demagoguery where they're telling people to cut your taxes in half, which you won't. Nobody's made that study, and people have to understand anyway that there's no way in urban America that you get $1 of service for $1 of taxes. If you did, then the lower income areas would not have any police protection, wouldn't have any potholes filled, or any of the other services that are needed. So we do help beyond our boundaries, but it's not going to happen. What
does all this mean to the county of Fulton, losing this jurisdiction?
And it changes it dramatically. The jury's still out as to just how that's going to end up. There's still a little unincorporated area south of Atlanta that Fulton has. Of course, Fulton itself still exists, as you understand, and all these cities are now in Fulton County. Although there's a move afoot to take out part of Fulton north of Atlanta and make that Milton County, like it used to be long years ago. All of that's going backwards instead of forwards. You know, we've been preaching for years that we needed fewer governments, not more governments, and this is just the wrong approach entirely, in my opinion. But I don't know that I can predict exactly how Fulton County will come out. I've had some ideas I've shared with Rob Pitts, who's a commissioner at large, and John Eves, who's the chairman, that they might look at providing services to these cities, including Atlanta, paving streets. When I was on the city council at Mountain Park, Georgia, the county of Fulton paved one of our streets. Now we had an arrangement with them. I don't remember exactly, but we could not have afforded to do it. And so maybe the county can use this tax money to do things for cities.
In Nashville, Tennessee, and in Jacksonville, Florida, they operate a metro government. That will never happen here, will it?
Doesn't look like it, but they're not all successful either. They're buzzwords like merger and authority and privatization, and I mean I can go down a dozen of them that sound good to the public, but they're not always good. And there are examples of consolidated governments where they didn't work, and but I don't think it's going to happen here anyway. I mean, I'm not against them. You just have to look at what you have in front of you.
Let's get back to politics for a minute, and your race for president of the Board of Aldermen. What do you remember about that race?
Well, the second time, and then I go back to the first and the second time, I was so sure of myself that I spent all of my campaign money being a proponent of good government and getting people to vote. I ran copies of the ballots, not my name, but the whole ballot in the newspapers. I paid for the ads. And I was almost acting like I was chairman of the League of Women Voters instead of a candidate for office, even though I had, I think it was 5 opponents that time and one without a runoff. But the first time, it was a hard-fought campaign. I remember even then I also got a heavy black vote. Back in those days, the black community had tickets, most particularly the Atlanta Negro Voters League. They had a strong ticket. If you won that ticket, that was almost tantamount to election. And they were very careful printing them the day before the election and distributing them that night. I mean, so nobody could counterfeit them and find out what they had and change it or whatever. And you didn't know until then if you were on the ticket. But the black community did not have enough then to elect, but they had enough to elect. Now, I'll tell you why I'm saying it that way. They didn't have enough to elect their own because the white influence would offset it, but they had enough to make the difference in anybody's election. Even though you might have a big, heavy white turnout, there were enough blacks in a block, as they were called then, to make the difference. So it was extremely important. And they had a lot of black rallies. The black churches were very active, and a lot of people fault them for that, for being political, but you know, and I would agree in the best of worlds it'd be good to separate religion from politics, but in that case, in those early days, they needed all the power they could muster to finally become part of the community with equal opportunities. So it was very important in these rallies. And they also had screening committees. In the rallies, I remember, most of which I repeat were in black churches. So there was some in the white organizations, maybe neighborhood associations or different things. But in the black ones, they would have so many, you'd have to run from one to the other. In fact, I had one volunteer in my office who used to get a stack of Guff oil maps and just mark on the map that night where I was going from this one to this one to this one, so I could take off like a bat from one to the next one to get there in time. And they'd have 3 or 4 in a night of these rallies. But I took the approach realistically that I felt that I could understand the black pressure, the needs, the problems and faults better than my opponents because I was Jewish. That I'd felt some prejudices myself. Now, I couldn't feel what a black could feel, but I felt I could feel it better than my opponents. I meant that, and I made that message clear to the audiences. I remember something where Helen Bullard helped me tremendously. The blacks also had screening committees where they would decide who they were going to endorse, add to their tickets. And you'd be invited to a group, there'd be 7 or 8 of them in a room, leaders from that church or whatever. And it was almost like what they used to call a hot box in a college fraternity or something, where they'd be pledging. You'd sit there and they'd fire questions at you. And I remember going to Helen Bullard, who I introduced earlier as the political guru of that era, who handled my campaigns for president of the board of Alderman and also for mayor, saying, Helen, prepare me for, I'm going to my first screening. She said, well, what do you mean prepare you? And I said, well, they're going to ask me tough questions, you know. Shouldn't we practice and think about them? And she said, well, like what? That is back in the early 60s, you know, 1960s. And I said, well, suppose they ask me what do I think about mixing white blood and black blood, you know, in the hospitals or whatever. And she paused and she looked at me and she said, well, what do you think? And it was just like lifting anvils off my shoulders, because then I realized, well, of course, what I need to do is just be me and tell them what I think, not try to second guess them. And if I win, I win. If I lose, I lose. But and that's what, from then on, I didn't have to prepare. In fact, I used to have when I was mayor, I had a call-in show on Channel 11 television on Sundays where we didn't even have a screener. They could ask anything they wanted to ask because, you know, I'm a pretty candid guy because maybe because of my ego. I feel I can do it, and if you don't like it, I'm sorry. But you know, so anyway, that was the effort for the campaign was strenuous. It was heavy, running from one place to the next, getting to know people, getting to learn big city politics, because there are a lot of phonies out there. I remember one, there was a guy named Smith who ran several times for different things, was one of my opponents. And I remember once at the Druid Hills Country Club in the men's room, and I don't know why we'd have a rally out there, it's outside the city, but there was maybe the Voters Guild or somebody held a session there. And he asked me, he said, "Sam, are you an opportunist?" And he meant it sarcastically. And I thought a second, maybe less than that. I said, "Yes, I am." You know, when I reflect on it, many of the things that I've achieved in my lifetime have been because of an opportunity that presented itself, and I grabbed hold and continue to do that. All right, talking about Ivan Allen and as mayor and me as president of the Board of Aldermen, I had gotten the legislature to add the title vice mayor. So I was president of the Board of Aldermen and vice mayor. Just two titles. It didn't change the office, because even without that, well, maybe not. Now, excuse me, I got to correct that. This added to that the vice mayor, in the absence of the mayor, was acting mayor. And so, indeed, at times I signed proclamations and, you know, took various positions for the city as its acting mayor when Ivan was out of town. But Ivan and I were on good relations, except that I knew he was not the same liberal leanings as I, but I knew him to be a person of integrity and honor and intelligence and commitment, and he had a good agenda for the city, and he was good for the city. So I didn't have any problem. The only time I recall that we were actually at odds was when he did the Peyton Wall, which was a foolish thing. He admitted later the way he tried to stop integration of a neighborhood by building a wall across the street, a barricade that would stop him from buying the next house or the house after that. And I publicly opposed his action. But we otherwise, you know, we understood each other. Helen Bullard, who I've mentioned a few times, a political consultant, represented both of us. So if we had any differences, she would bring us together. I remember one time, incidentally, with Ivan, where some of the black leaders called him about some problem and asked if he'd come over to the Butler Street YMCA where they were holding a meeting, and he asked me to go with him, which I did. And Raleigh Browns, who was a City Hall reporter for the Journal, was sitting in the reception room, and he said, "Raleigh, you want to go with us?" "Yes." And so we go over there. We're the only three whites in the room, and I don't remember the issue now, but Ivan was getting ready to say something. He pointed to Raleigh. He said, "Now, Raleigh, this is off the record." And then he went ahead and said his statement. Raleigh didn't make any notes, but he had them all up here. The next day, front page of the paper, and Ivan went ballistic. he called him and he's screaming. He said, "I told you that was off the record." And Riley said, "Yes, but I didn't agree. You didn't ask me if it was." And of course, that was sort of splitting hairs there. But Ivan did not have a lot of political experience, I guess is what I'm alluding to, is that he was naive in that way. But he had a lot of business experience. But even the business experience used to shock him, and the difference between that and political activity. When he'd have right at first few months, when he'd want to do something, and he'd tell his staff to do it, and they'd say, "Well, wait, we can't do that. We got to go through this committee or that commission or this authority or whatever." And he just wasn't used to that, as running a big company, the Alderman Marshall Company. He knew how to execute, and he wasn't allowed to do that here. But he was very efficient. And unlike me, I'm just the opposite. I may be efficient, but I've got stacks of papers. He didn't have any paper. In fact, his desk was a library table. It didn't even have drawers in it. And he had an in basket and an out basket. And as soon as something hit that in basket, he grabbed it and initialed whatever instructions and put it in the out basket, and that was his day's work. The rest of the time he'd be putting in his office with a glass to put that ball in there. He did his work quickly and didn't spend a lot of time. He didn't. He was a little jealous of Bill Horsfield, who had preceded him, because Bill was so well known. He was a mayor's mayor. He'd been mayor of the city of Atlanta for 20-something years. The first time Ivan went to one of these national meetings of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, all he heard was, "How's Bill Horsfield? What's Bill Horsfield doing? This Bill was a great mayor. We should have enjoyed Bill." He heard so much of it, he came back to Atlanta. He said, "I'm never going to another meeting." He said, "Sam, you can represent me." And so from then on, I went to all of them, the U.S. Conference of Mayors. In fact, became president of the National League of Cities. And the only other mayor from Atlanta that's ever done that was Bill Horsfield. But Ivan learned as he went along. He was courageous to go to Washington and testify in the civil rights legislation, which brought the wrath of his friends at the Piedmont Driving Club. They just couldn't stand it that he would do that, and they said some ugly things behind his back. But he was doing what was best for Atlanta. In other words, he may not have felt that was right, but he felt it was the right thing to do. And I respected him for that. And we became much closer after he left office, and I left, and we were friends and would discuss politics and things of issue. In fact, I met just yesterday for an hour with Bo Allen III, who's the grandson of Ivan's, who wants to go into politics when he gets out of college. So I was consulting and advising.
You mentioned liberal. Back in those days, a liberal was a person who believed in equal rights and equal opportunity, as opposed to a conservative who believed in racial segregation. That was before the black community of Atlanta really made its wishes known politically. How did that transition occur?
What do you mean by the transition?
Well, from being an electorate that could not elect one of their own, but could elect someone that they united behind.
Well, it happened because they grew in numbers. The black population just kept increasing, and the registration kept increasing, and their courage too increased. Their determination. I still marvel at the young college students who did the sit-ins, who knew they were going to go to jail. I remember my father, as a lawyer, at times when I was a child, saying how sad it was that this client or that client was in jail or something. That seemed like the worst thing that could happen to somebody, is be in jail. And yet here these young boys, knowing they would go to jail for this, because the law at that time was clear, that blacks could not have public access. And so that was extremely courageous, and you have to, in my opinion, admire people who have that much commitment to bring about change. Well, I am a liberal, and in fact, I'll share with you that Cynthia Tucker, the editor of the Atlanta Constitution, Journal Constitution now, mentioned in one of her editorials about 3 years ago, I think, that I was a moderate, identified me as a moderate, and I wrote a letter admonishing her. I said, don't you call me a moderate, I'm a liberal and proud of it. And she sent me back a real nice handwritten note apologizing. She won't do that again, she said. But most of my friends are much more conservative than I. It seems they've gotten even more conservative, and most of it, I think, is motivated by money, by wealth. That it does make a difference with people.
You're a religious man.
It depends on the definition, I guess. I don't go to services very often, but I'm very proud of my religion and what it has meant to me. And I believe in God, and I have respect for all religions.
I'd like to talk to you for a minute about 1962. Several historical events in Georgia changed the political reality forever. First of all, the demise of the county unit system, which certainly penalized your city of Atlanta and others. Secondly, was reapportionment, which increased the power of urban areas. And thirdly was the election of a young state senator, very progressive young state senator by the name of Carl Sanders. What do you think about that period?
Well, that was an era of great pride to those of us who were believers, that there could be a better life, that Atlanta should not be ostracized and treated as a stepchild. I was involved in those days in different ways. I was very close to Morris Abram, an attorney who played a role in defeating the county unit system. And incidentally, just in random, I was treasurer for Adlai Stevenson when he ran, Fulton County treasurer when he ran for president. I was very involved, maybe the only noticeable politician in the write-in vote for Ellis Arnold that ended up with Lester Maddox being our governor, but I believed in Ellis, but Carl Sanders, and incidentally Helen Bullard handled his campaigns too, and had to overcome, they were calling him Cufflink Carl because he was a sophisticated, Dapper Dan sort of, and she made him chew chewing gum one time on television while he was being interviewed to try to overcome that other image. But I still see Carl around from time to time, and we're friends, and he brought a lot of credit and honor to our state. We've had some good governors from time to time, and we've had some sorry ones. I'll tell you an anecdote about the media one time where the legislature had given me the power to put on this sales tax for MARTA that I was mentioning earlier, which was very unusual, and I wanted to say thank you. There'd always been frictions between state government and the city of Atlanta's government, always. And I said, they've done a wonderful thing for us. I want to say thank you. And the press didn't buy that. They weren't interested in that at all. At my Monday morning news conference, and I'd say, let's thank this. And no, they wouldn't. So I forced it on them. I called a news conference on the front lawn of City Hall facing the state capitol. During the night, I had a flatbed truck drawn in there with a full-size billboard on it covered with sheets. We unveiled it. It said, "Thank you, Georgia lawmakers." And then we dug a hole in the ground. We said, if there's ever been a friction between us, we're going to bury the hatchet. And we put the hatchet in there. And then we sent all the secretaries from City Hall in pink hot pants. You couldn't do that today, but over to the state capitol with the little key to the city for every member of the House and the Senate. And then we sent over proclamations thanking them for their help and inviting them over for peanuts because Carter was there, and chicken because Maddox was there as lieutenant governor, and Coca-Cola because everybody's in Atlanta, you know. And they came over for that, and that forced the newspaper's front page. It must have been an 8-column picture of that "Thank you, Georgia lawmakers." And so sometimes you have to push, you know.
Let's go back to 1969 when you became a candidate for mayor. What persuaded you to run?
Well, I thought I could make a contribution. I thought I could do some things you know, I'm independent enough. I don't have to be mayor. I don't have to be president of the council. I don't have to be president of the Buckhead Coalition. I'm that independent. Not that I'm independently wealthy. I claim I'm wealthier than any of my friends, but it's not money. It's a state of mind, and that's a wonderful asset if you're independent. And so that was one of the things I wanted, was if I had that power, I could do some things that hadn't been done, such as the appointments that I told you about, bringing in women and bringing in blacks, and also appointed a Greek to the to the city council. I would reach out always to try to improve conditions, and I had the power to do that as mayor.
Did you know then who your opponents might be?
No. When I first announced for mayor, I don't believe I did know. I don't remember knowing.
Well, your most formidable one was Rodney Cook,
yes.
who you mentioned.
Yeah.
He was a Republican, who had been in the legislature and on the board of Alderman, and who had run very well among the black population of Atlanta during those elections. But you were able to overcome his popularity quite handsomely. It seemed to me, and I'm no expert on Atlanta politics, that Cook's attempt was to put together the old Hartsfield coalition of businessmen and others. And if I'm not wrong, and you can correct me if I am, I think Mayor Allen was involved in that.
Yes. Rodney had the business power structure. He had the newspapers. He had Allen supported it, and you know there were some overtones of anti-Semitism that entered the campaign. There was a cross burned on my front yard during that campaign. My brother, who was a rounder, a bachelor, playboy, had gotten in a lot of adverse negative publicity in his behavior, and although never do anything illegal, but I mean, you know, just hanging around with some of the bad actors, and that was what the opposition used to. In fact, Ivan asked me to withdraw from the race, and that I think probably helped my campaign rather than hurt it. But anyway, you know, they lost, I won. 4 years later, I lost, they won. Jesse Hill was the one that told me, "Sam, we can't support you anymore. We thank you, but we can't support you anymore." And it's just not very surprising.
Yeah. Well, but it's understandable.
Yeah.
You understand.
Yeah.
And Maynard Jackson, the eventual winner, had the courage previously to take on one of the most powerful United States senators in the country, and was defeated terribly. But I think that his people got confidence in him. As you look back on your 12 years in the City Hall of Atlanta, what do you think was your most outstanding accomplishment?
Well, probably MARTA, creating MARTA. But you know, the building the Central City Woodruff Park with no call on the taxpayer, building the first enclosed arena, the Omni, with no call on the taxpayer. Now that was a situation where I mentioned earlier about my background that helped me. I used my legal background and my real estate background to structure that Omni program, that development, where the taxpayers would not have to pay anything, even if they never sold a single ticket to the events. In other words, we got cousins to pledge income from the parking decks that were already there to underwrite the bonded indebtedness, and his rent was equal to the monthly note and the taxes, and the maintenance and management of the building. So we had no expense. We had this big new building for events, and his benefit was that he had no taxes to pay because really we owned it, even though he had control of it. And secondly, he had a very low interest rate on the loan because they were city revenue bonds. So like I said, I was able with a sharp pen and paper to work out a good deal for the city.
That was very clever. That was a time when arenas were being built by taxpayers' money all over the country.
Yeah, this was the first. In fact, more recently, the Phillips Arena was built similar to that, and they overlooked the fact that I had already done that before.
Well, if you had it to do over, would you have done anything differently?
Well, I wouldn't have appointed the chief of police that I appointed. He turned out to be much more conservative than we had been led to believe, and it was important in the black community that we have somebody who they trusted as well to manage public safety, and that was a mistake. But I had letters from prominent judges and district attorneys and other law enforcement people that pledged, that praised him, and I was just misled. I'm sure there were other mistakes along the way, but
that's the one that sticks in your mind.
That's the one that, yeah.
I'd like to talk for a minute about party politics. Great change in Georgia. Republicans have taken over the governor's office and the legislature, and every department head now is a Republican, and most state employees are Republican. And it seems that Democrats are losing ground. Some believe that it's because the party is too dependent upon minority voters and labor unions, and that is destroying the party. Do you believe that?
Well, I'll be honest that I have not analyzed it. I'm probably the leader in the nonpartisan arena. As I mentioned earlier, I actually created that for Atlanta's elections. And to this date, here I work with an organization, the Buckhead Coalition, made up of CEOs of major firms. As you might imagine from that profile, they're mostly conservative Republicans. But they knew when I came on board that I was a liberal Democrat. But we avoid partisan politics. Now, we get involved in city elections because they're nonpartisan, but we do not take any position or in this boardroom discuss any partisan races and or partisan issues. So I really can't answer you as to how it has come about, but it's been quite a change. Of course, the Democrats of yesteryear in Georgia were pretty conservative. So the title identity of Democrat versus Republican is not a very clear line, and you have to make sure you're talking which era you're talking about when you describe them. But some of my friends that are staunch Democrats wouldn't appreciate me saying this, but there's some Republicans that are decent people, you know. Just have to admit it right here on camera that there are indeed, and some of them have done some good job. I mentioned Rodney Cook and Richard Freeman, the Republicans elected to the Board of Alderman, were two of our best members, no question about it. And you know, I'm just not bogged down by party title. I try to find some good in everybody.
One final question. How would you like to be remembered?
I don't plan to leave.
Well, in the event you ever do,
oh, I see.
How would you like to be remembered?
Well, I've not thought about that either, but I don't attach much importance to that. I guess that sounds odd. I may be the first person you've interviewed that will phrase that in that way, but like today even, people that have 2 or 3 well-meaning, maybe 1 or 2, have suggested some kind of honor for me, a street name for me, or statue or something, and I've turned those all down because I've said, first of all, I got my own policy that you shouldn't do that for people who are still in life, but I don't even look for something after I'm gone. I'm going to do my work while I'm here, and I continue to work. I must be at least 70 years old now, and I'm still at it day and night, you know, and I plan to continue. You know, I don't know how to answer that question.
Well, I'll tell you this. One of your former colleagues this morning told me that Sam Massell is one of Atlanta's best mayors ever. So you might not know how you want to be remembered, but a lot of people will remember you.
Well, that's kind. Thank you. That's very nice.
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for this.